United States Department of Agriculture.
Thanks for joining us for the third webinar in our series on transdisciplinary approaches. My name is Jessica Shade. I'm a national program leader at USDA NIFA. I'm one of the organizers of this series, and what this series sets out to do is highlight the opportunities and challenges of transdisciplinary approaches within agricultural research. Before we get started, I wanted to note that we are lucky enough to have Dr. Kalavacharla with us today. He is USDA NIFA's Deputy Director for the Institute of Food Production and Sustainability. And as such, he oversees all the divisions within the Institute of Food Production and Sustainability, including the Division of Ag Systems, the Division of Animal Systems, the Division of Plant Systems Production, and the Division of Plant Systems Protection. So welcome, Cal. Would you like to say a few words to kick us off?
Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate the opportunity to welcome our viewers here, our audience. This, as Jessica said, this is the third Transdisciplinary Approaches webinar hosted by NIFA and the National Ag Library. And this series, as you may know, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and I hear that in this third round here, we have a lot of new, colleagues from across the U.S. who have joined us here. This is in direct response to reviewer and applicant comments asking for more guidance on what transdisciplinary approaches entail. And it started out of conversations within USDA NIFA and the Institute of Food Production and Sustainability, and then expanded to other colleagues across the agency and the department. So just like many of us within USDA and within NIFA, I've been on the other side. I've been in academia for a long time, and I have been a faculty, done research, taught, and so on and so forth, and worked with extension. And one of the important points is that many times the problems facing the broader agriculture, food agriculture, natural resources, and human sciences are multifaceted, and traditional disciplinary boundaries could limit our ability to address them. And again, as we all know, a lot of effort has been put into trying to address these complex challenges that single disciplinary approaches aren't able to solve. These approaches, transdisciplinary approaches, can increase the likelihood of new practice adoption, and they can also help reduce the potential for unintended consequences of more narrow research. These transdisciplinary teams also enable cross-learning and thinking about new innovative approaches that is out of the box, helping us to get out of our silos. And really, you get to hear from the other side, from the other folks that are on your team. And I was fortunate. I was in Delaware for most of my academic career, and we had a team of ag econ people, soil scientists. I'm a plant biologist myself. We had environmental scientists, data science specialists, and all of that. And it really helped us to think about what we were doing in a completely different approach. So I really, feel that this is useful. Of course, you know that several NIFA programs request the use of transdisciplinary approaches, such as the Specialty Crops Research Initiative and the AFRI Sustainable Ag Systems Program. And I know you'll hear a little bit more about that as well. Before we get started, and I turn it back over to Dr. Shade, I would like to acknowledge a few of our colleagues here. Our wonderful speakers, Dr. Greta Landis from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dr. Hailey Wilmer from USDA ARS. Our colleagues from the National Ag Library, we always have a great collaboration with our NAL colleagues, and Scott Hanscom, who is our Deputy Director there. Pamela Veal, thank you for all that you do. Jessica Alt and Rodney Richardson, and these are our colleagues from NAL that have been working with our IFBS team. And then from NIFA specifically, Dr. Jessica Shade, Megan O'Reilly, Dr. Tom Buick, and Dr. Amy Ganguly from the Institute of Bioenergy, Climate, and Environment within NIFA. But this is really a team effort, and there are many others to thank, to list them all. But in short, I'd like to thank all the 46 people on the Transdisciplinary Approaches Webinar Planning Committee from government agencies, universities, scientific societies, and more. So with that, I turn it back over to Dr. Shade, but thank you for the invitation and look forward to hearing it.
Thanks, Cal. And I just want to echo Cal's thanks. There's so many people who've been working on this. So we'll go ahead and get started here. We always start our webinars with our non-discrimination statement. We have zero tolerance for discrimination at USDA, and if you'd like to make a complaint, you can do so using the contacts on this slide. For those of you who aren't as familiar with transdisciplinary approaches, as Cal mentioned, we have a lot of new people who might not have been on the last few webinars. Or if you just want to learn more about the what and why of using transdisciplinary approaches, check out the recordings of our past webinars, which you can view on this now, the NAL website. So there's the link there. We also have another webinar that is planned for May, focused on tribal research partnerships, indigenous agroforestry, food security, and sovereignty. I'm co-organizing this one with Frank Lake, a research ecologist and Pacific Southwest tribal liaison for the Forest Service. So Frank, if you're on, thank you for all the work you've been doing on this. We don't have a registration page up yet, but I'll email it out to everyone once we get that posted. And please stick around after the presentations and after the Q&A, we're going to have an evaluation poll where you can help us improve our webinars for the future and help identify topic areas that you'd be interested in seeing us focus on. This really does guide us and change each of our presentations. So make sure you stick around for that. So today we'll be looking at lessons learned from teams using transdisciplinary approaches. So what's worked, what hasn't, to give you some insight into how these principles play out in the real world. In our last two webinars, we gave you conceptual information about why the use of transdisciplinary approaches are important and how to structure and manage teams more effective for more effective projects. But one of the things we heard from attendees from that poll I mentioned is that they're also interested in seeing what those principles looked like when they were employed in projects. So this webinar is going to look at strategies that projects have used so you can see what it looks like. Amy, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to introduce yourself and our speakers and the SAS program.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessica, and welcome everyone. I'm a national program leader in the Global Climate Division at NIFA, and I provide leadership for several of our climate change programs, as well as the Sustainable Agricultural Systems Program, which Cal mentioned earlier. We commonly refer to that program as SAS. Under the Agriculture Food Research Initiative, SAS is seen as our flagship program, which seeks visionary projects in the areas of food and nutrition security, strengthening the bioeconomy, and climate-smart agriculture and forestry. Some key elements of this program are that the work needs to be systems level. It needs to have full integration of research, extension, and education activities. And these projects need to be using transdisciplinary approaches. I'm very excited to introduce the guest speakers that we have with us today, starting with Dr. Hailey Wilmer. Hailey is a research rangeland management specialist at the USDA ARS Range Sheep Production Efficiency Research Unit in Du Bois, Idaho. For short, we call that the Sheep Station, which I had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time at in my early years. Originally from Montana, Hailey started her journey as a high school ag teacher. She completed her master's and PhD in rangeland ecosystem science at Colorado State University. And prior to her current position, she was a social scientist for ARS, and she also worked in Alaska with the U.S. Forest Service. I've long been a fan of Hailey's work, which currently encompasses research questions addressing the long-term effects of grazing, climate, and other disturbances on high elevation rangeland plant communities. Hailey does not shy away from tough issues and is helping us understand if mainstream science can integrate local knowledge to support ranching livelihoods, biodiversity, and food production, some of which you'll hear about today. Our second speaker will be Dr. Greta Landis, who is an evaluation and research specialist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She has worked in agroecosystems for over 15 years as a researcher, student, and a farmhand. Her graduate research at the University of Wisconsin evaluated beef cattle grazing for habitat management on public grasslands and the decision-making processes in successful conservation partnerships. She's currently housed at the Natural Resources Institute, and she and her colleagues provide evaluation services for local and national programs in environmental education, farmer training, conservation monitoring, land management, and transdisciplinary agricultural research. In fact, Greta and her team are spearheading efforts to evaluate NIFA's SAS program, and she's going to share some of her initial findings with us today. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear these presentations, and I would like to invite Hailey to get us started.
Thanks for that introduction, Amy. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to talk a little bit about our experience with this approach in rangelands. Let me move my group of beautiful faces here. Of course, like any transdisciplinary team, I had a lot of help putting the thoughts together for this project. Justin Derner, Lauren Prensky, David Augustine are all at ARS in Fort Collins or Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Gwender Meredith, who I think is on the call at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, is a rangeland social scientist that we collaborate with. The goal of this today is just to present some case studies from rangelands where transdisciplinary approaches have provided a lot of insights for the scientific and management community that we've been able to document with social science, and also through our publication of biophysical research in animal and rangeland science, and then to reflect on those lessons towards some future directions for our work. So I'll focus on the collaborative adaptive rangeland management, or CARM, experience, but also draw from other case studies. I'm focusing on rangelands as agroecosystems and social ecological systems. I think they're a really nice place to start these conversations because they're complex landscapes, and ecological and social processes shape all kinds of outcomes related to biodiversity conservation, food and fiber production, land, vegetation, soil, and fuel management across the US, recreation and tourism, shifting rural community dynamics, and climate change adaptation. So they're multifunctional landscapes, and managers are already, in many cases, legally required to integrate multiple disciplines and scales to make their decisions in these landscapes. The question for scientists is then really, can science catch up to those managers who are expected to think about livelihoods, conservation, food production, and multiple ecosystem services? So in that context, there are a number of experiences that our team has had that we draw from for these lessons. The Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management Project is an ongoing project that started in 2012 at the Central Plains Experimental Range. And so I would encourage folks who are joining the webinar who'd like to learn more to contact Justin Derner, David Augustine as points of contact for that, or to check out their great website that has all of the papers and kind of the journey there. The Thunder Basin Research Initiative, which is an ongoing collaborative research effort in East Central Wyoming, where Lauren Prensky is a point of contact, and she could speak about her experiences in a slightly broader scale of collaboration in similar rangeland settings. And then emergent projects, for example, at the Barter Brothers Ranch in Brown and Rock counties in Nebraska, and here at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in Idaho and Montana. So Gwender Meredith and I are points of contact for those. So please reach out if you are interested in these approaches or would like more details, because we can certainly spend about 10 minutes just listing all the collaborators and all the different case studies. But I'll focus today on the CARM project, which was a real source of hope for us on the hard grass, as we like to say. It was established in 2012. And here's a picture of sort of that context on the shortgrass steppe. If you haven't been to the shortgrass steppe, it's the driest, hottest part of the Great Plains, or part of it. And the Central Plains Experimental Range is an ARS location just to the west of the Pawnee National Grassland. So it's about an hour and a half northeast of Denver. And in this context, ARS had provided 85 years of fantastic agricultural research to support the ranching industry there. But conservation concerns over grassland birds and vegetation and habitat the need to restore ecological processes to the landscape, and concerns for shifting demographics and economics facing rural communities were kind of coming to a head. And so folks were reaching the limits of our methodological approaches in just being siloed on the experimental range. And we really set out in a journey together to think about integrating multiple knowledges and disciplines into the science on the experiment station in a meaningful way. These figures are from a paper led by Maria Fernandez Jimenez, my advisor, who was the lead social scientist on the original NIFA-funded adaptive management component that set out to track this process and understand what happens when you bring a group of folks together to work in a scientific context on a landscape such as this, where we have conservation and livelihood goals. The simplified adaptive management approach that the group chose to take is shown here with this sort of 6-step process where science and management are integrated or they intersect. And then the collaborative, adding C to the acronym, is in the right corner here. It's a more complex process where there's public participation and integrated into this scientific method. So there are many traditions of participatory or transdisciplinary work, and this team chose to use the adaptive management framework because it was appropriate for the rangeland context. It was something that was going on a lot in public lands management discussions and conversations about how to think about complex systems where we don't necessarily have an innovation to offer. We need to do more research to understand how to apply different strategies, evaluate them together, and then adapt them in this multi-use landscape. There were so many wonderful collaborators and funding. ARS is really kind of the long-term foundation of the project. And then they used funding from NIFA, from the Colorado Experiment Station, from Western SARE and the Center for Collaborative Conservation to kick off some of the different elements of the project and to engage different researchers and stakeholders in different ways. CARM is also part of the long-term agroecological research network, which is an ARS initiative that spans the country. Back in the days during my PhD, when I had time to make nice little clip art for everyone on the project, these are actual, silhouettes of actual people who are collaborating. So this figure shows kind of the general idea of the project. They brought together this collaborative team and they set up a ranch scale study that would run for 10 years. And that had basically 10 pairs of pastures that were similar in topography and soil, and those were managed with the same stocking rate of yearling steers from May to through September. On one set of those pastures, the land was managed as sort of the business as usual in the local community with long-term grazing without adaptive decision-making. And on another set of pastures, this group was in charge of decisions about goals and objectives, stocking rate, stock density, pasture, grazing sequence, and rest rotation, and triggers for adaptive management. And they committed to apply that approach for 10 years and monitor the learning and the decision-making. So if this was sort of the hypothesized progression from adaptive management to CAM after 10 years, this is what it really looked like. And it was a much more complex and nonlinear process whereby ranchers, conservation NGOs, scientists, and agency folks came together through the CAM process and their social worlds intersected and overlapped and at times were mismatched. And the learning for multiple goals, beef, grassland birds, drought resilience, social learning was nonlinear and complex. Now, this is pretty nerdy and it's hard to sort of think about this as a nice narrative arc. So let me translate a little in honor of Kurt Vonnegut into a little bit easier to understand story. The CARM experience is about a group of people who had reached the limits of their methods to adapt and manage for multiple goals on the same land that they cared about. So they committed to coming together and to using science as a method to share a vision for sustainability and to work over a 10-year period on that effort together so that they could have rigorous evaluation of different hypotheses and different trade-offs related to managing this rangeland system. And along the way, the journey was not always kittens and rainbows. It was challenging. They committed to improving grassland bird habitat and ranching livelihoods, but they didn't automatically achieve those outcomes. They struggled to learn and they struggled to achieve conservation and livestock weight gain goals. However, that process of sitting together for a long time and thinking together brought them eye to eye with one another on the land, and they began to engage deeply with each other's worldviews and knowledges and with the scientific process, and they began to really see each other as human beings, and they began to see each other's knowledges as valid. And over time, that growth of trust built the capacity for learning and scientific productivity, and that capacity for learning and productivity developed the capacity for adaptation. There are a number of integrative and disciplinary scientific products for this. It really is a research farm, and I'll talk a little bit about the benefits of that in the lessons, but I encourage you to check these out. They range from economics to social science to rangeland ecology, and really it allowed the team to publish together and push one another towards thinking more integratively and more transdisciplinarily with those stakeholders. And over time, we even kind of started to call everybody partners. They're all in the team together, but also to seek out advancements in their own disciplinary fields and their own societies and journals as they work together on the landscape. So some key lessons, some positive lessons or achievements were that the ranch scale, long-term and multifunctional approach was meaningful for managers, agencies, and conservation organizations who are maybe not getting as much out of shorter term or smaller scale ecological experiments in the past. So the agency demonstrated, an ability to adapt to real world problems and to address those facing complexity and uncertainty, just like managers really do. That deep engagement across disciplines with local knowledge and with the land builds place-based management capacity as well as scientific innovation. And it's just a lot of fun. That commitment is what builds trust, and trust is necessary for learning, and learning fosters community and capacity. A great example of this was just the capacity of that team to weather the COVID-19 pandemic. Meeting with ranchers over Zoom isn't something that a lot of teams would have pulled off, but folks were committed to the community and really kind of the CARM family and interested in advancing the project as they could during that time. The NIFA funding that the team used sprinkled throughout the long-term project boosted the baseline project at ARS and enabled additional social science capacity as well as stakeholder engagement, and allowed us to develop a transdisciplinary science ranch where we could break out of those silos and come to a higher level of understanding about the system together. So trust, learning leads to adaptive capacity is kind of the key take-home slide that I like to repeat over and over again. If you're familiar with the participatory or transdisciplinary literature, there's just a ton of evaluative critiques spanning, this discipline goes back for about 100 years in the US at least. So just highlighting some of those from the perspective of this team. Of course, there are institutional and structural needs to support this kind of work. The funding and incentive structures in conventional academic research are not well designed for the kind of long-term trust building and the sort of complexity of these projects that are nonlinear, and they face a lot of logistical and sort of social context challenges relative to other more disciplinary or less participatory approaches. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg where the need for trust and engagement is there. You need trust and engagement to build trust and engagement. And so if you don't already have a long-term relationship with a community, it may be unrealistic to expect immediate outcomes in the transdisciplinary space without that prolonged engagement. And I saw Allison Meadow was on the webinar. She and some co-authors have a great paper that talks about this, led by Dan Ferguson, about the need for long-term engagement and collaborative partnerships to foster actual change-making through the transdisciplinary process. But in addition to those really well understood institutional and structural needs, there are methodological needs to support this kind of work. This is a distinct approach in terms of theory and practice relative to what most ecologists, most climate scientists, even most animal scientists are used to working in. Extension professionals and social scientists do carry kind of that disciplinary knowledge, but those fields tend to be underfunded relative to some of the other disciplines, or maybe are brought in after the fact as folks develop their biophysical question and then want to sort of sprinkle humans throughout. So really elevating the extension knowledge and the disciplinary knowledge of folks who work and live on the ground in that extension capacity, and also the social scientists, was really important for our project. And as Justin pointed out, when we talked about developing this webinar, the shared social ecological systems framework was a really nice start for the CARM team. So thinking of rangelands not just as an ecosystem and not just as a social system, but really trying to work in that in-between space. But that framework alone is not enough to provide us with a methodology or a theory of method that we can actually apply. And so the CAM approach in the CARM project was really nice because we had sort of a methodology, this idea of the adaptive management cycle and the collaboration was sort of built in, and then we had to turn cattle out and we had to collect the data. It's a little bit more tricky when your project is less tangible, maybe working in a climate modeling project or something where you're not actually applying an experimental treatment together. The complexity of wicked problems, or those problems where they're so complex we can't even agree on what the problem is, that extends into the scientific method and disciplines. And so having the ability to talk to your peers about what's going on and to know thyself, know the context that you're working in, and to build a strong, cohesive team is really important. And then with that, there are logistical and ethical challenges of working with communities. There's a lot of literature on this. But the question is sort of, are you able to leave it better than you found it? Are you extractive in your approach, and how can you gut check that as you go along? And then this was a great point from Lauren Perensky, that the real question might be, at what scale do these approaches offer solutions or make change? And there might be broader social, economic, or climatic drivers of change that this approach can't tackle. For example, the cattle markets are a big driver of what's going on in rangelands. This isn't something that the CARM team can really tackle. So, okay. So just some key sort of negative lessons. I don't know if they're really negative, but challenges that are sort of drawn from this experience. Looking ahead, the CARM project has had multiple iterations of their management system and their learning process, and they're looking at continuing to develop that. And what we're really seeing is in a space where, for example, with drought management, what producers have been doing may not really fit the climate of the future, but what the literature suggests doesn't really fit what producers need. This CARM platform in the middle is just a fantastic experimental zone to try out some new things. The question will be sort of, making sure that knowledge is implemented outside of the experimental station, and sort of the network approaches that the team have taken and highly collaborative nature, I think, is really helping to build that capacity. In my case, I've really been drawing from the capacity of ranching communities to foster collaboration. So since I was a graduate student and then postdoc on the CARM project, I've moved on to a permanent position at another ARS location. And in this location, I'm really being mentored by ranchers in terms of how to collaborate, how to establish relationships, and also how to have a holistic science and management informed understanding of these complex ecosystems. And finally, I think they're also really mentoring to me this long-term outlook, this thinking beyond the 3-year, 5-year career, timeline to a broader look at sustainability. The goal there is to move from sort of an innovation adoption approach to agriculture science to a co-creation approach that's adaptive and responsive to dynamics on the landscape. And certainly drawing from the lessons from evaluative science and lessons from practice case studies to new phases and projects. So we are actually launching at the Sheep Station a collaboratory effort for the next 5 years. That's a replication of the CARM project, but in a different setting. So the question still remains, if managers are already being asked to integrate multiple disciplines and scales, can science catch up? I think we can, but it's a complex process, and we've got a lot of continued evaluation and reflection to do to get there. Please contact us if you'd like to learn more about any of these specific studies or lessons, or you need a copy of any of the literature that I mentioned. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful reflections generated by you and your team, Hailey. I want to remind everybody that we're going to have a question and answer session after our second presentation, so please stick around for that. In the meantime, feel free to use the question and answer box. I see we've had 3 questions so far, so please utilize that. And your presentation provides an excellent segue for Greta and her colleague, Amber Mays, to share what they're learning. And so Greta and Amber, the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, that was a perfect tee up. Hey, Hailey, thank you for an excellent presentation. Also want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Amber Mace, here with me. We're going to talk a little bit about some tools and tricks that we've seen transdisciplinary teams using in action in the Sustainable Agricultural Systems program. But first, I do want to acknowledge before we get going that Amber and I are presenting from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is on ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place called Des Jope. And give a little bit of an overview where we intend to go today. So we'll give you a brief introduction to the Sustainable Agricultural Systems program. Amy Ganguly already did a great job with that, but we'll fill in a few more of the gaps on what those projects look like. Then we'll talk a little bit about our role in trying to identify some of these tools and tricks and best practices, as we're calling them today, for the SAS program, and some of our the background on our methods we're using to do that. And then we'll dive into some 4 main areas of those lessons that we've seen so far. We'll be keeping things fairly high level today because our analysis is still ongoing, but we'll be talking a little bit about what some of these transdisciplinary teams are doing in terms of project leadership and management, a little bit about handling some of those partnerships and collaborations as projects develop, a little about team culture and ways to support diversity, equity, and inclusion on large transdisciplinary teams, and a little bit about the tools and communication strategies that help all those teams get going. So I will pass it to my colleague Amber to talk a little bit about the SAS program.
Thanks, Greta, and thanks for having us. So yeah, the Sustainable Agricultural Systems, or SAS, program kicked off in 2019. And the overall goal is to kind of help transform the U.S. food and ag system. And as you know, using transdisciplinary approaches. So that's why we're here on this webinar. And so far, about 44 projects have been funded, and they tend to range in amount from 5 to 10 million. And those are hosted at roughly 36 different academic institutions in terms of, the main lead institution. But those all together are collaborating with over 400 different institutions and partner organizations. They span across 27 different states, just in terms of like host institutions. And it represents so far more than 400 million in public investments. And so, just to give a little bit of a sense of the different projects that have been funded so far, they really range in topic and scale. So these are just some screenshots from different websites that projects have developed. So ranging from grasslands, trying to rethink grassland management with Grassland 2.0, diversifying the Corn Belt, looking at sustainable shellfish aquaculture using robotics, down to growing power or transforming kind of ag production using agrivoltaic systems. And then here's kind of a conceptual map of the different host institutions that Greta helped create. So you can see that it really spans quite a bit across the US. I'll go to the next one. And then, we wanted to talk a little bit about our sort of unique SAS grants. So we're looking at, as people based in University of Wisconsin Extension, kind of looking at now that as of 2021 was when our project was funded. So now that the SAS program has been underway for a few years, can we kind of help summarize those emerging impacts, kind of identify the key factors that are contributing to project success, maybe like pitfalls and challenges that projects are encountering, kind of how this grant program can be most effective in achieving those goals we touched on at the beginning. And then also we're working to develop some evaluation tools for these projects. So hopefully they can sort of have a workbook or some guidelines for, effectively evaluating their individual projects as well. And then, yeah, we just wanted to make sure to mention, we also provide kind of that external evaluation support for several SAS projects based in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. So that kind of gives us the macro as well as micro view into this program. So yeah, next we want to talk about the tools, tricks, and some best practices for these transdisciplinary projects. And so, yeah, we were particularly interested in understanding kind of the systems, tools, and aspects of team culture that really have been contributing to success. And so kind of we came in with sort of the questions around, what factors are kind of enabling effective research, education, and extension activities, and really thinking about that transdisciplinary context rather than, the research, as others have mentioned, being siloed from each other, and then maybe just thinking about education and an extension as like afterthoughts. And then also thinking about, given that these projects are really focused generally on kind of having that community level or agricultural level impact, how can they build those mutually beneficial partnerships, not just within academic institutions, but also with the communities that they're trying to serve. And then, yeah, also thinking about what they have done thus far or what they could be doing to have more supportive and inclusive teams. Next one. So yeah, our methods thus far, we've done some document review. So looking at project progress reports and NIFA publications, as well as just kind of reviewing like which projects, there's a fair bit of documentation on which projects have been funded thus far, kind of how they described their projects in a written way. And then we spent a lot of time doing some key informant interviews with the SAS project leads in particular. So program directors, as well as some project managers. And then, yeah, we've done a lot of coding of transcripts from 36 different interviews. Lots of excerpts from those transcripts. So that's been a very, rich data source for us, for sure. And then we also have some observational data. So we've been hosting kind of an evaluation community of practice. So for evaluators who are on all of these various, over 40 projects, if they're interested, they can join our kind of Zoom meetings and learn from each other, share tips and tricks. And then we tend to participate in some of the program meetings. So like those projects that I mentioned that we are funded on as the external evaluator, we get really like that close-up perspective on how their meetings are going, what things they do that work well to sort of, build that team and ultimately encourage that transdisciplinary work. I basically touched on those last 2 points at the same time. So now I will pass it back to Greta to sort of talk more about the results. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Amber, for that great introduction. So as Amber said, we have kind of a unique position in our role of both getting to see on a fine scale what these projects look like by operating as their external evaluators and providing some of that evaluative thinking Hailey nicely teed up in the last part of the webinar. But we also are trying to take this high level view to summarize across the SAS program, what are these kinds of tools and tricks that are most common. So this is just a snapshot today because we're still, as I said, this is still on ongoing analysis on our part. But we wanted to dig into 4 main areas that we felt would be really useful for this webinar series. So the first we'll dig into is project management and leadership. So I'll start there. So when we think about what overall themes have come out of our interviews and analysis on project management and leadership in the SAS program. The first theme that came up was really around coordination across these large teams. So probably not the answer you were hoping for, but regular meetings were a really big part of helping these projects be successful in filling folks in on and creating project cohesion, especially as things develop and lots of moving pieces are happening. So more regular meetings and more cross-project roles. So in addition to regular updates, having individuals as part of a transdisciplinary team that get to see into lots of aspects of that project. So project managers, evaluators, also folks who do project communications and get to see, share the stories of the project through social media and with partners, and interdisciplinary students who may work across different parts of the project were all really key roles in helping create that sense of project cohesion. In addition, making space for reflection and learning was a theme that came up a lot, perhaps a little bit biased because we are evaluators, but we find this really important, just making space at large group meetings to take stock of how things are going and what could be better, and using different activities to do that and engage a wide variety of folks across different disciplines and backgrounds. As well as providing more anonymous opportunities for feedback through team function or culture. So understanding, how happy are folks working with this kind of team and what kinds of things they need to feel supported and like they have a good sense of what's happening in a given project. And some teams we saw were really making this kind of reflection and focus by prioritizing peer-reviewed publications on their processes. So using that kind of end goal to really take stock of the kind of learning they were doing and do more publishing on team function or other aspects of the project management. So just a few samples of a team function report or a evaluation exercise at a group meeting. We love sticky notes and butcher paper in our team. So anytime you can get people writing and moving around and thinking about how their work interacts with other folks on the project, we found to be really successful. So in addition to those kinds of practices, we also found a lot of teams referencing guiding team documents and revisiting them as a key part of creating cohesion across different disciplines. So a couple examples of those from an evaluation perspective include things like a guiding set of values and principles, or a logic model or theory of change diagram. So illustrations of sort of what the team wants to communicate and where different teams' work fits into an overall picture, as well as organizational documents like data management plans, publishing guidelines, shared reporting expectations for all different items that came up as really useful for both onboarding new individuals and for just creating those shared expectations across disciplines. Having equity goals, projects thinking really actively about how they wanted to do their hiring more consistently across the project, as well as then, as I mentioned, sort of onboarding materials and strategies like a project CV or annual reports being in a really easy place to access, a shared pool of graduate student resources or annotated bibliographies, and then just continual introductions of new project members all really made a difference in the interviews that we heard. So to move on to the next sort of bucket of the themes we'll be talking about today, from a kind of overall project leadership and moving into collaboration and partnerships. So we heard a couple important themes here around communication, which probably makes sense. So as Hailey also mentioned, you need trust to create trust. So thinking about ways to provide consistency, even in complex, adaptive, large projects, with advisory board meetings, updates, and providing opportunities for input with partners and stakeholder groups, and even projects using technical assistance venues with growers, even like customer management type software like ticketing systems or call-in options, to really make sure they were getting ample opportunities for input or requests from the farmers and growers they were working with. Part of that means developing contact lists and mailing lists and keeping those up to date as projects move along. I don't know that we mentioned earlier, but SAS projects could be up to 5 years in duration, so that provides time for a lot of change over the course of a project. So making sure you're being consistent in the folks that you're reaching out to during a project like that. And then finally, I know we live in a post-pandemic world, but in-person gatherings are invaluable for building trust and helping maintain those shared goals. We heard that across many of the projects we talked to, particularly folks with a more national scope really struggled to create that cohesion without in-person gatherings and found that when they were able to hold them, they made a really big difference. So in addition to that multi-way communication, flexible budgeting was something we heard from a handful of projects that really helped them communicate with their collaborators that they were able and willing to listen and pivot in response to their needs as projects developed. So they could really, having a pool of funds to respond to advisory board feedback and being as transparent as possible with subcontracts and budget structure was really important in developing meaningful partnerships. So related to both of those is just having diverse structures in partnerships. We heard SAS programs or SAS projects are quite flexible in some ways. So they have subcontracts, subawards, and other ways of funding and paying partner participation. But we heard from a few projects that were really working to do capacity building with, say, member organizations or other agencies working on trainings to sort of further the implementation of the things they were innovating, as well as funding to support participation and reduce risk. So when projects were asking growers to participate with a experimental crop, having funding for crop failure was one way to build trust in that collaboration. And the final point here is just on shared leadership, that these projects really making sure that folks outside the university were in positions of decision-making power, really communicated with partner organizations that they were being heard. So moving right along here, this is, of course, team culture, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is, of course, a huge conversation, and we are only getting into just the tip of it today. But some themes that we've heard in the SAS program that were really important for maintaining and supporting effective team culture were around these bullets here that I'll address. So the first was recruitment and onboarding, just having a process to get people up to speed on big unwieldy projects like these, constantly adapting and innovating. So really having relationship building and trusted messengers among partners, working with leaders in different nonprofits, and hiring from groups that projects intend to serve. So making sure that there are people who represent the backgrounds and experiences of the intended beneficiaries of the project were also represented in project leadership. Having support for students was a theme that came up a lot. So peer mentorship, seminar series, advising other ways to highlight junior scientists was really key in groups with successful team culture, because it also helps address some of the power imbalances inherent in both academia and in partnerships with other organizations. So making sure some groups did things like divide the advisory board into multiple groups to make sure they could hear effectively from different stakeholder groups without worrying about that power imbalance, silencing some folks, and making sure there was funding available for non-university based organizational staff, really acknowledging the time that it takes to have all those meetings and do all this communication as part of a transdisciplinary project, making sure that partners are paid appropriately. And then finally, just providing multiple training pathways for students and partners. So we've saw some really effective initiatives to build capacity with different options for groups that may have different timing or commitment constraints. So trying to come up with ways to train and onboard and support partners that feel appropriate for their interests and background. But really, all this really just comes down to listening. I realize a lot of what our themes we've been sharing around team culture and management come down to just commitment to really learning about the history of different partner groups, working with farmers and nonprofits and all kinds of folks who are trying to make change on the landscape. The SAS program really wants to make sure that their cultural differences are acknowledged and culturally appropriate solutions are what they're providing to implement. So I have a quote here from an evaluator that Amber and I admired, which is just, compared to implementing something that fails, listening is incredibly cheap. It's always worth taking the time to really make sure that feedback is being heard. So that takes us to our last sort of bucket of themes here today on the tools and communication strategies that some of these projects are using. So this will dig down into the weeds a little bit, and I'm sure as tools, more and more artificial intelligence tools become available, this list will get even longer and more complex. But we heard about projects using tools from the business world or tech world to really help manage some of these big transdisciplinary projects, such as project and client management software, things like Smartsheet or different kinds of data dashboards where team members could get up to speed, ticketing systems or databases like, spots like GitHub issues to track changes in modeling tools or programming issues. And then having an internal project website where all those guiding documents and different project tools are shared to make sure folks have access to get caught up to speed in different parts of the project. We also heard a lot about external communication approaches. So because SAS projects are so stakeholder driven, a lot of projects were investing in short video content, blogs, or public webinars or discussion series to make sure their ideas were getting out to the groups they want to serve, and also that feedback was then coming back to them. So publishing annual reports and newsletters in attractive formats, and sharing social media, and developing press contacts for annual meetings to be able to share and celebrate some of the successes that they were having along the way. So that was a quick overview of many aspects of the SAS program. So I wanted to take a moment and sort of summarize what we just dug into. So I do want to acknowledge the best practices for these projects are not prescriptive or universal. Many of them are related to work that's already been done in the literature, but the characteristics and processes of successful projects that we've seen include this real prioritization of cross-project communication, and meetings, but using guiding documents and policies that help balance structure with autonomy, giving folks both the tools they need to do the work and lead their teams. And in doing that, making space for reflection and incorporating feedback. So really making sure that there is a space to hear from all folks involved in the project. That also means committing to shared leadership and partner-led activities. So making sure that there are opportunities for input with project features like flexible funding, creating support systems for new hires, junior scientists and partners that help reduce those power imbalances and help mentor new scientists and leaders in the field. And then finally, project management tools from any field, it does not need to be agricultural, can really help improve documentation and share stories of these projects with the general public. So I just want to acknowledge next steps for our team. As Amber mentioned, we have this kind of meta grant of evaluating a grant to evaluate a grant program with our role in the SAS project or SAS program. So we'll be convening a project directors meeting to try and help share additional lessons learned across these teams, and are currently working on summarizing a much more detailed report on these tools and tricks and best practices, particularly at different stages of project development, because initiating a $10 million project looks a lot different than wrapping one up. So looking at what folks have learned from moving into the implementation phase of a lot of these projects. And then finally, our role will be developing an evaluation handbook with some suggested approaches for tracking learning and emerging outcomes with these transdisciplinary projects. So we'll be helping try and further some ideas around how you track progress when things are adaptive and innovative in area and transdisciplinary. So we'll be working on getting that out to evaluators in the field, and these are in the next year or so. So stay tuned. So with that, I think I will say, please do follow up. Similar to Hailey, we love to talk more about we would love to talk more about transdisciplinary work. So feel free to reach out. We will share our contact information after this webinar. So with that, I will pass it back to our moderators and stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you so much, Hailey and Greta. It's really great to see how these approaches have played out in the real world and the challenges and benefits that you've seen and experienced. It's complex, but so are the problems we're addressing, so not surprising. So we have a lot of questions, fantastic questions that have been coming in. So we're going to start working through those. Some of them have been answered via chat. I might ask them anyways, just because they're so great. I feel like other people who are here might be interested in them. And if we don't get through all of the questions, I apologize in advance. We're getting great engagement. So follow up with us. I think both Hailey and Greta have said this, but all of us love talking about these topics. So feel free to reach out to us directly if we don't answer your question. And then also I want to emphasize that people should stick around after the Q&A session because we have that evaluatory poll. So let's get started with these questions. All right, so we've had actually a few questions come through about building trust, which is a huge part of developing a team and being able to use transdisciplinary approaches effectively. So what are some keys to that trust building? How do you go about it? Especially when you really want to engage in each other's worldviews and perspectives. So some examples that one participant asked about are frameworks from facilitators, team member skills, qualities, interaction setting, etc.
Hailey, would you like to go first? I'd love to hear from a ag research team's perspective. And some long-term ecological studies, but go ahead.
So, it's not a one-night stand, as Kareem Ali Kassam says. It's this very long-term process, and a manager recently described trust as doing what you said you would do to me. So following up, and I really like that. So in the case of the Carn project, there was a long-term relationship with the ranching community, and there was ongoing engagement with them that Justin Durner kind of did on a monthly basis. And so that's an example, I think, of like a person who crosses boundaries or spans boundaries or code switches to engage multiple communities. And if you can engage, like for example, the extension community, they can almost self-facilitate that translation and come back and say, okay, I'm noticing this, can you adapt, or can you respond to this in a different way? So those sort of gatekeepers or code switchers, or like that diversity and inclusion on your team can really foster that. But those folks also put their reputations and their social capital on the line when they invite researchers in. So it's really common for us to call up an extension aid and say, hey, could you get me some ranchers? I need some perspectives. I want to do this participatory project. And they're putting them, all of their chips on the table for you. And then you don't show up again with any sort of data or like any way to help. And so that's something that we've really kind of emphasized of like, giving back to that community in multiple ways and being respectful of those translator folks. It's really important.
I would echo all of that as far as making sure it's clear that we're not going anywhere with partner groups. And I've heard that from some of the SAS projects that we work with more individually, things like providing lunch, showing up to community meetings where folks are already gathering just to learn and listen without expectation for participation. So trying to set expectations with groups about what SAS teams can plan to share and support, how they plan to support them, funding for those organizations or those organizational positions, stipends and other ways of sort of just compensating people for their time appropriately. Amber, do you have anything you'd want to add to examples that we've heard. Yeah, I think just, yeah, to echo what Hailey said, just being clear about expectations early and often.
Great. We've also had a few questions about how teams have changed since the pandemic. So what are the new challenges that have arisen? One person said, Hailey, you mentioned something like partners getting out on the land together, and then the persistence needed to connect via Zoom during the pandemic. So what did your team notice about how trust, learning, adaptation were affected by meeting in person versus online? Kind of a suite of questions about the pandemic and how things have changed and online versus in person. Greta, I know you flagged this in one of your slides as well.
Yeah, keeping up momentum online is really hard. It's hard to keep people engaged when it's just through Zoom or just through email. I think there's something still invaluable about in-person meetings. So finding ways to gather safely has been a theme in some of the projects that we've seen, using those pasture walks or other outdoor venues where growers and producers tend to gather. Has been a really helpful feature, but it is challenging, especially, survey response rates are down, participation is down. People have a lot of fatigue from online participation in a post-pandemic world. So thinking about ways to make make participation something fun and engaging. So back to lunch, but other kinds of ways to build community around a project, I think have been really helpful.
Hailey, anything to add?
The same. I mean, I also have a larger regional and national stakeholder base that I'm inevitably going to be Zooming with, or the weather is terrible in East Idaho. And so it's just part of our world now. But in our new project that we're starting, at the first or second meeting, a rancher came up to me and he said, you know what, we need to be around a campfire. And we need to be sharing food. We need to be, chatting this out under the moon. And so we're really looking at ways to foster that culture so that when we do have to meet on Zoom, we have the shared trust. But I do think a lot of our agricultural stakeholders just think if you can't make it in person, then you're not genuinely there. And that's a real context for us to kind of struggle with as we're talking to folks who are in DC or Seattle and can't make it to Dillon in a snowstorm. So it's real.
Yeah. So another question, what are some common challenges to avoid in transdisciplinary teams? And this kind of goes hand in hand with another question, which is things that you would have done differently.
There's a ton of research on this, and there's just a ton of work from the development fields and rural sociology on participatory projects gone wrong or used to coerce communities. I mean, it's almost more than the success stories. And so it probably is context dependent, but there are some real ethical and logistical challenges to doing this. And so actually, I think the risks are quite high for everyone involved. And those should be taken into consideration in a really meaningful way, because it's one thing to sort of use the words in your grant application or in your project proposal. It's another to actually follow through. So folks can get burned, or folks can just spend a lot of time on something that doesn't go anywhere. Or, what do you do when you find a really challenging finding that the community is going to struggle to deal with? So that's why we sort of emphasize the ethics of building a strong team with strong leadership and considering the ethical dimensions of how you're representing and working with folks, how you're promoting self-determination and sovereignty over data, and how you're sort of leaving the landscape when you leave. Because the stakes for this kind of stuff are pretty high. And there are a lot of researchers who don't necessarily want to jump right into this because they recognize that it's slower. that publication might be a little bit more challenging. That, for example, the CARM is like, it's basically pseudo-replicated, because to do a ranch scale study, you've only got 2 ranches. That's about as many as you can squeeze out of 3,200 acres. So there's some real complexities to this that shouldn't be taken lightly. And you've got to be able to recognize them and move forward as they come up.
Yeah, I would echo that. That's a really great answer. And one way to mitigate some of those issues is having an evaluator or a trusted way to get feedback from those partners, so you can management and leadership can pivot to that kind of feedback and see some of those issues emerging or people losing energy or losing trust before it gets too far. We've heard that over and over from project directors at SAS who wished they'd hired a project manager, weren't sure about the value of an evaluator before they had one and had that source of feedback. So just having those kinds of roles and avenues to get more input and make sure and help give management the leadership that feedback, I think is incredibly helpful.
And that kind of dovetails into the next question, which is, what about evaluation of these complex projects? So can you share a few examples of how transdisciplinary teams evaluate their progress?
I hope Allison Meadow is still here on this call, because she has lots of great answers for that. But in our experience, we've taken much more developmental approaches with evaluation. So it looks a little different than sort of summing up all the impacts or outcomes of a project when it wraps up. It uses processes that provide a lot more ongoing feedback, and then retroactively looking back at a project and sort of examining sort of where things were laid out at the start and what kinds of changes have been made, and so it's we've used much more participatory approaches in evaluation to try and get that input, see what kinds of change were meaningful to people across SAS projects. So it's hard is the short answer, because many of these projects evolve a lot as they move along. The goals that were set at the beginning may not make sense anymore by the end of the project. So it requires using different methodologies. Our group has been interested in something, a newer area, principles-focused evaluation. So trying to use values and sort of guiding statements about those values to assess projects and project progress. But it's hard is the short answer. Amber, would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good overview. Yeah, and I would say it varies by project. Like there's a lot of different goals and different contexts, different people they might be interfacing with, different communities. But yeah, evaluators can help with assessing impact in those communities by being that kind of neutral third party, whether it be with like a survey or interviews to kind of capture that really honest feedback, as well as like the team functioning that we sort of touched on in our presentation. So yeah, because trust breaking down and siloing can certainly happen just sort of within those project teams without the proper tools in place. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to the question in the chat, it agreed that the impacts aren't always apparent or success factors aren't always apparent, but trying to agree or get input on what defining success for that project from a wide range of people is one way that we try and mitigate that. So defining success for different areas of these projects with the folks impacted by them.
Hailey, anything to add to that?
We haven't always had money for an evaluator or a facilitator, and sometimes I've seen that like the young grad student is the one who gets put in that role, and like the social scientist kind of becomes both, and that can be really challenging. If you can avoid that, I would recommend it. Someone asked how much do you balance like funding for facilitation. It's so critical, and everybody should be trained in facilitation. It's actually pretty empowering to learn some of those skills. It's fun. So if you can, we haven't had opportunities on these projects for formal evaluation, so we're self-evaluating, and so we have to develop processes to write papers about the methods and the process in a way that brings folks to the next tier of learning. And then we kind of go back and forth with evaluative scientists. We know, like, I'll ask Allison Meadow for some time for advice, and then, you know, we'll work back and forth as we can. But it's just a tough position to put a social scientist in on the team if they're a junior colleague and just trying to get through their dissertation. So,
Hailey, do you have any suggestions for those facilitator trainings? I'm interested in.
I think that's one of those questions I'd have to punt. Leaders as conveners is one that Forest Service and ARS have offered. A lot of my training came from, like, being a classroom teacher. And so extension folks have that body of knowledge, agriculture teachers have that body of knowledge. So education is really important field for that. But I think that the climate hubs have offered some of those trainings. I don't, Greta, if you have other ideas.
Those are all, yeah, great suggestions. And not off the top of my head, but I know would also welcome that from Amber or others on the call. If you feel free to drop them in the chat if you have a favorite. I did fail to mention earlier, to take a step back, that the Sustainable Ag Systems program does require an external evaluator. External is a little bit of a misnomer that we think, at least for our team, we really believe, like, being involved with a project and enough to learn all the key features and get to know people and build trust is really important, not just popping in to sort of assess those final outcomes at the end. We really like being involved from the start. So it's a wide range of sort of involvement. Different projects have different needs, as Amber mentioned. But I think, to echo Hailey, having someone who is a trained facilitator and comfortable getting that kind of feedback to help mitigate those power imbalances is really important.
Yeah. And what about the constraints placed on projects by funding cycles? So most research projects rely on, 3 to 5, 6 max years of funding. I know that's NIFA. Most of our programs top out at 5 years of funding. So what can be done in that amount of time, and how can researchers overcome the short-term nature of funding versus the long-term need for this kind of work?
It's a big question. I can start, but I would love to hear Hailey's perspective. In the SAS program, I think we've seen some success in that kind of investment in member-based organizations or coalitions that already have some momentum, trying to partner with groups that are already working towards some of the same goals as the Sustainable Agriculture Systems program. So I stumbled a moment there, but I was thinking of the Grassland 2.0 project based out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Has been recently developing something they call the Grassland 2.0 Academy. So working with another pool of funding, working with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, to develop a training for conservation professionals who can write grazing plans and help educate farmers on pasture management and help people set up fencing systems, those kinds of things. So more of the train the trainer model, looking at ways to work with groups that are already building toward those same goals and help with educational or communications infrastructure for those groups is one way to sort of get that staying power. But it is hard in 5 years.
Yeah, in writing the presentation, our group thought about that a lot, and folks offered some ideas for maybe some preliminary engagement funding from like 1 to 3 years to get things rolling. And then as you build your capacity and structure and team, you can move into some more in-depth processes or link up with other networks. But it really does take kind of like a cohesive shared meaning outside of an individual project to stick it out and see results. And we have an example of that from the Thunder Basin Research Initiative that Lauren Prensky leads, their individual projects feed into this broader context. So there's land managers meeting all the time and kind of, debating and battling it out over how they should manage public lands. And that's an ongoing social process that the science sort of swirls around and comes back into. And so the individual projects feed into greater knowledge for land management. It's maybe not, we came up with this finding, it was implemented right away. And so having that long-term vision and that community basis, I think, is really important. And that's where working with agricultural communities is really key. Those are the folks who don't turn over, whereas our public land management agencies, folks might stay in a job for 5 to 6 years and move on, but the ranching families are there for a long time. The indigenous communities are there for a long time and can offer that sort of that perspective and that cohesion and push the direction with agencies like ARS that can, sort of stick it out too. So it's really tough, but.
Greta, one of the things that you mentioned was the need for different different knowledge, different training at different stages of a project. So one of the questions is, did or should project leaders put an emphasis on relationship building in the early stages of these projects, or is that important throughout?
I mean, I think important throughout, but definitely at the beginning. That's a great question. Sort of the amount of, it takes a lot of effort to set up that initial infrastructure to figure out what kind of message a SAS project sort of communicates about its goals because of how large and complex they are. I've seen some of that trying to figure out how to have a cohesive communication strategy as folks are out talking with communities about what they're doing and why was really useful in a number of projects. So another cross project role, that communications person. We've seen some success with students even in that role as well, but just having folks who see different areas of the project and can help create a narrative for the group was really helpful. And then making sure to follow up on those relationships throughout the project. So yes, I would, the short answer is yes, it is very important in the early project stages.
All right, so here's another question. How do you balance capacity building for long-term partnerships and cross-disciplinary projects with the need to adapt to changing industry needs and challenges?
I work in a system now that's like tens of thousands of years old, sheep production. So we don't really have we have emergent challenges, but if we can deal with these long-term challenges, we'll have more capacity to be agile and responsive, I think. And so now we're dealing with wildlife coexistence and climate change, and those kinds of adaptation and coexistence questions are really old. And so I think thinking long-term pays off in our system. I'm trying to think of anything that's, you might be in an immediate drought situation, or, one of the projects in Thunder Basin dealt with a plague epizootic with their prairie dog populations. And so the dynamics there are really challenging, and they go back and forth between the ecological and the social system. But when you kind of zoom out, you still want to have your structure and your principles in place to do that work in a meaningful way long term, because that's the slow and steady is going to be there. And maybe graduate students can tackle those smaller things, or shorter term things, but they'll develop the skills to think long term as they do that.
Okay, so with constrained budgets, it can be difficult to allocate enough resources to coordination. Are there any rules of thumb for how much budget and how many FTEs should be devoted to team coordination? This kind of plays into one of the questions we were talking about earlier, which is how important it is to have facilitators and make sure that you budget that into your budget.
Yeah, it's also a range. I wish I could give a better answer than it depends. I think having the project, the SAS, I will say that the SAS projects who were able to dedicate a full or nearly full-time person to project management had a lot, just were much more calm in their interviews with us around how things were going. Just having one person who was aware of around scheduling and what was going on at all these different elements of the project was really useful. So I mean, I think more is better, but it is, I recognize that it is a big constraint. So anywhere that students can be incorporated into those roles, as far as I saw a question in the chat about sort of fostering skills around transdisciplinary work, our evaluation unit has a number of students who help us with data analysis and reporting, and also do really great work around facilitation. We help them build those skills. We've also seen that with the communication students and even some project management assistance from students. So I think there are ways to stretch a budget when you're increasing training and capacity by bringing in new folks. But would also love to hear Hailey's thoughts on that.
It's a little bit like house chores. Everybody has to help, or farm chores, you know. I mean, you can't just have a superhero facilitator that takes care of everything. It's kind of a shared responsibility, and you just never know, and someone's going to be out for something anyway. So, but I generally say at least one facilitator and one social scientist, each hydrologist. This is my hydrologist ratio. You know, try to keep it balanced, because when you are the only facilitator, or you're the only person trained like in the humanities or in the social sciences, it can be quite lonely, and you can find yourself sort of up against some disciplinary barriers that can be quite frustrating, and that can lead to burnout, I think. So having some allies or some folks that are kind of interdisciplinary to share that burden is really important, because it can be emotionally pretty challenging to facilitate these kinds of groups. And you know, if you're empathetic, as many of us are, you can end up sort of in this role where you're trying to build bridges, and it's not as easy and fast as you'd like. And so having kind of a team approach to that can be really helpful. We didn't have a facilitator or a project manager on CARM, so we kind of had this rule that we would like co-facilitate, and you just weren't allowed to facilitate a discussion of your own research because you would get too passionate about it. And so you could provide your data and then step back and let another scientist foster kind of the discussion of that. And that worked pretty well. But for bigger projects, I think you would absolutely benefit from multiple people helping coordinate. And the NLPEC is an expert teacher, instructor, facilitator from the Climate Hub, and came in and really ramped stuff up later in the project, the time that I was there. And that just those skills where you could just see the difference in the experience for people, because you want them to have fun when they show up, right? You want that to be something they want to go to.
And we are almost out of time. We still have so many questions. I'm going to try and smash 2 questions together here to try and get more of these in. So one is, how can graduate student training begin to foster the skills needed to do this transdisciplinary work? And another is, okay, so you look at the graduate student level, what about on the academic faculty level? How do you see this playing out with academic, in an academic setting, so tenure promotion, et cetera?
I can start with that. In part, we've seen institutions are still catching up, I would say, to the importance of transdisciplinarity, at least the folks that we've interviewed in the SAS program. So needing to get a little bit more creative about how you report outcomes or sort of outputs for a project beyond just traditional peer-reviewed papers and things like that. Because these projects are so partnership and relationship driven, thinking about other ways to communicate success, sort of groups reached, or participation in different aspects of the project, using evaluation methods that look at sort of more ripple effects from a given activity or event can be really helpful to try and tell that story, because as I think Hailey mentioned, publication in transdisciplinary work can be a lot more time consuming and slow, and just it's challenging to make sure that work is rigorously represented. So the short answer is I don't have a immediate success story off the top of my mind about tenure promotion from a transdisciplinary work, because but there are more multidisciplinary degrees and programs that sort of training new students. So there's a brand new one at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that is indirectly related to some of the SAS work that we've seen. So I think there's hope, but I don't have a quick answer to that.
That's all right.
Yeah, I don't either. In my experience, the graduate students offer kind of an interesting project for different disciplines to get together. And so they can really be pushing the field or dragging their professors along. I certainly learn more from my students than I do just reading on my own or sitting in my own little world. So having students around is really valuable. And now I think I'm, trying to engage more with undergraduates and younger career folks who just bring just so much energy to our work, and we don't always have that engagement at ARA. So I think the need is there and the opportunities are there, and maybe it's just a matter of multiple disciplines or multiple methods in one thesis or dissertation. And certainly qualitative social science has been a huge part of my capacity to understand these systems, just riding around with folks and their pickups and having some excuse to write down some notes and go back to them again and again has just been absolutely huge. I think it's just been really powerful. So that's one method that really just gets you in, and it forces you to kind of see someone else's perspective, literally, because that's the idea. So
I love that. Pamela, you can go ahead and post that poll now. We're getting towards the end. And while Pamela is posting that, I just want to say thank you, Greta, Hailey. I learned so much from this webinar. It was really fun. I want to apologize that we couldn't get to all of the questions. Actually, one of the things that came out of this poll is instead of an hour-long webinar, we've stretched it to an hour and a half to have a full half hour for these questions. But this is just a really interesting topic. So we always get more questions than we can answer. So reach out to us and keep the conversation going. Amy, do you have anything to add?
I just want to echo you, Jessica, but also say we've had tremendous engagement. I know the presenters have been quite busy, but we've had just about 30 questions that appeared in the chat. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your wisdom with us. And we look forward to more sessions in the coming months.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone, all of the attendees who are participating and engaging and asking those questions. A lot of those questions that you posed to Greta and Hailey are questions that I didn't even think of until you posed them. And I was like, oh, actually, I want to know the answer to that too. So thanks to the speakers, thanks to the attendees. We'll go ahead and leave this poll up for another couple minutes so you can fill it out, but please fill it out. It's really helpful for us, and please reach out to us, email us. So thanks, everyone.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.